Welcome, hello. Michael and Jean-Francois, I'd just like to start with you. I mean, you've actually been up there. How did you feel watching this movie? Your reactions to people who've been in space? Michael.
It's very moving. I had tears in my eyes. It's, you know, when I'm in front of those guys who went to the moon, I'm like a kid. Like those kids looking at us who have been on low Earth orbit. And, you know, we've seen the Earth very close to our spaceship because we are only a few hundred kilometers altitude. But seeing the Earth so far, like John Young used to say, I hope it's good for science because I don't feel it's good for John Young. It's, I think it's the beginning, and like we heard at the end of the movie, you know why the dinosaurs died? It's an American author who said that's because they didn't have a space program.
Michael, how about you?
I'm exhausted. It was beautiful. Very moving for sure. I feel like Jean-Francois that if you watching this from your seats feel like you're in awe or in amazement, I think we feel the same way. You know, what we did was important in its own way, but what they did was speechless. I'm speechless.
Rory, how about you? You directed your own documentary about NASA. Of course, you have such a personal connection to this story, of course, because it was your uncle, John F. Kennedy, who launched the mission to go to the moon. What did you think?
Yeah, well, I want to congratulate you on making such an extraordinary film, such a special film. You know, I think it is so profound to have this experience and to have this extraordinary footage that really transports you as an audience member to this moment in history. Really, thank you, and I loved how you just let the footage tell the story, you know, and which is a brave thing to do as a filmmaker, to not do the interviews, to not have the narration, to not fall back on sort of the things that we all fall back on, and really let us just experience this, and it works. You know, it works in a really big way, and I think I agree completely with both of you. This sense of the story is so profound in our human history, and to think back where we were 60 years ago before this. You know, and when my Uncle Jack gave that speech in 1962 at Rice University, you know, we didn't have a rocket ship. We didn't have computers in the way. It's like we just didn't have the technology, and to think that, you know, he said we're going to get there within the decade, and then we did, is so amazing. And I just want to thank you for taking us back to that moment and helping us understand the importance of it and the meaning of it.
Tom, talk to us a bit about making this film, 20 years of research.
Well, it wasn't 20 years by myself. There were other people working on various facets of it. But it was a long time coming. There's a lot of footage in here. There's probably a couple of hundred different sources that we use. And to assemble it, like Rory said, in this way, it's unique, and it's very hard to do, as you can imagine. And the beautiful thing about the Apollo program is it was filmed quite a bit, both by NASA and the news media at the time. So there was a lot from which to choose, but actually there's too much from which to choose. And so we had to go through, kind of find the major points, the major missions, and then find footage that spoke to that. And then the other thing we wanted to do, because some people are very familiar with the story, we wanted to create fresh eyes for people to see this story. So you'll see a lot of local news reporters, for example, from Houston or from South Florida, things like that. So even if you're familiar with the Apollo missions, you're going to hear it from people you've never seen or heard from before. So it feels brand new, and that's what we wanted to do. And it was a lot of trial and error. One of the things that I told my researchers was, Walter Cronkite, who's wonderful, I told them, you know, put in all the Walter Cronkite that we think we need, and then throw out as much Walter Cronkite as we possibly can.
Just to remind everybody, Walter Cronkite was the American news
CBS.
anchor who basically hosted this whole event for America.
So that's how we did it, and I'm very grateful for everyone coming. I'm exhausted too watching it.
I have a lot more questions for you, but let's just turn to the audience. Does anyone have a question in the house for any of these guys? I know, Tommy, it was funny, we were talking about this earlier, and you were telling me a bit about some of the parts that didn't make the movie, one in particular, about the BBC footage that's been lost.
Yes, the BBC, we used James Burke, who you may recognize. He did his television series called Connections in the 1980s. It was very popular, but he was their space reporter. The BBC moon landing footage, the actual moments of the moon landing, has been lost. No one knows where it is. It's either been taken or, at the time, a lot of news stations would copy over because tape was very expensive. And what I found out, I guess only in London, the BBC decided to do something a little different because the moon landing was so out of this world. They brought in the band Pink Floyd to play, and this was before the Dark Side of the Moon album, and so Pink Floyd was playing in the studio of the BBC while they were landing on the moon. And I so wanted to get that footage, and we couldn't find it anywhere. The footage, there's crazy footage out there. When the camera, one thing that didn't get in that we did find, when the cameras on Apollo 12, they pointed the camera at the sun, is what happened, and they burned out the camera. And so the news stations had to scramble, the networks, and two of them built sound stages to reenact what was going on because they still had audio. But if you remember the movie The Sound of Music, there's a famous scene with the marionettes by a guy named Bill Baird, The Lonely Goat Herd, it was called. NBC got him to do marionettes of the astronauts from Apollo 12. And they can't find that footage. However, we found out that in the state of Iowa in the United States, there's a museum to Bill Baird, because that's where he's from, and they have the footage. But so I thought that was a great victory as far as research goes. But we wound up not using it because it was a sore thumb of a story. We had to keep going.
It's so interesting to hold this event here in Monaco. First of all, it was the request of Prince Albert himself to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. And I don't know if all of you know this, but Monaco actually has its own space agency, so to speak. SSI Monaco even has plans to put a Monaco residence into space in the very near future. We're talking 2020, 2021. Michael, can you talk to us? You're involved in this. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so I'm working with a company called Axiom Space, and our sort of midterm goal is to build a commercial successor to the International Space Station, of which you showed some imagery toward the end of the film. This is a government, a project of 5 government agencies around the world that is in orbit today, going around the Earth with 6 people on board constantly. But it will, sometime in the next decade, be deorbited because it will sort of run out of life. And none of those governments have plans to build a follow-on station, so we would like to provide that commercially and serve the same users as are using the space station today, plus others, including private astronauts. So in the shorter term, we want to start practicing, if you will, by taking private astronauts and some professionals to the space station in vehicles that we would lease from a provider, either in the U.S. it would probably be either SpaceX or Boeing, and take 4 or 5 people at a time for 10-day missions or maybe longer missions to do research. And we're cooperating closely with SSI Monaco. I think I saw Dr. Aygün, who was the CEO earlier, and we would very much like to invite anybody who wants to come.
Jean-François, you flew, I believe, with one of the very first space tourists a long time ago, maybe 2005, 2006. Is that correct?
That was me, actually.
Oh, that was you. Sorry, Mike, that was you. So tell me a bit more, because she was blogging at the time, which was kind of new back then.
Right. So,
and, yeah, tell me a bit
it's a
about
wonderful story. So I was scheduled to fly on a Soyuz capsule, 3 people to the ISS to spend what ended up being 7 months. And my crewmate was a Russian professional cosmonaut, and the third person was going to be a space tourist. And this is 2006. I wasn't too keen on the idea, to be honest. I thought it was only for professionals, etc. And when a few things happened where she was substituted with only about 6 weeks to go, so I just started to get to know her then. And we flew together. She only spent 10 days and flew home with the crew that we relieved. But during those 10 days, the experience with her was so positive in that she was doing this thing which was new back then called blogging. And she was reaching, they've done the math, over 2 million people during the time, explaining to them what the experience of living in space was like. So astronauts are not terribly good communicators generally, but people like that who really can connect to people who otherwise would not have cared about what's going on in space, I became enlightened to this idea of democratizing access to space, which is why I'm working with this company to try to get more people to experience.
And that's really interesting even for astronauts. I mean, look at someone like Thomas Pesquet today, who was so great about communicating, going into schools. But, for example, Jean-François, when you were training, were you as celebrated here in France? Was it as big a deal? Did they encourage you to do that?
You know, I flew as an astronaut of the European Space Agency. So I was a bit forgotten by France and the French Space Agency, who still had a bilateral cooperation with the Russians and sometimes with the US. But ESA, until the last selection of astronauts, was concerned about communicating to the government how we spend their money. It's only with the last class we selected in 2009 that we decided to employ community managers 2 or 3 full-time for each ESA astronaut in space. For Tim Peake in the UK, for Samantha Cristoforetti in Italy, Thomas Pesquet in France. So it helped people to understand better what we do, to make ESA known, and also the work and the challenges.
Est-ce que vous avez des questions? Here we go. There's a question right here. Oh wait, qui a le microphone? Allez.
Sorry, my
Stand up, please. We're going to do. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much.
Oh no, just 1 second. So this lady first.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you. My name is Eric, and so I was so fascinated by your movies, and it's very, of course, for human history, it's very incredible. And I was wondering how much does it cost to go to the space that NASA is organizing for sooner for 2020.
2024. Yeah. Shooting to go out and have a
price of the cost of the travel cost.
Who can talk about the cost a little bit?
Yes.
I can say for Europe, it costs the contribution of Europe to the Human Spaceflight Program, the ISS that Michael described, is €1 per year per European citizen. €1 per year. But of course, the US are putting more.
Well, I read an article recently that said $20 to $30 billion was the number that I had seen recently for this NASA space program to get someone on the moon with the view to going toward Mars in 2024. It's a lot of money. Une autre question, voilà. Vous, ici? Il faut qui a le microphone. Le monsieur ici, après vous.
Thank you. Hollywood did a movie some years ago about the near Apollo disaster, and I was wondering what you guys thought of it. Was it any good or was it all bull?
Who's that question for? The astronauts or for Tom? Anybody? Roy? Who would like to speak about Apollo 13? Roy?
I liked Apollo 13. I thought it was a good movie. I think Ron Howard was the director, and I think he went to great lengths to try and get it right. It followed the trajectory of the story that we followed. I grew up in a city called Cleveland, Ohio, and Jim Lovell, who's on Apollo 13, he was also on Apollo 8. He's from my hometown, so it was very big news when I was a child growing up. I like the movie.
I interviewed Jim Lovell for the film that we did on NASA, and I think he really liked the movie. So I think that's a good sign.
Alors ici?
I have a question for the Monaco Residence project. How could you own a landing on the moon? How is it possible?
C'est quoi les questions exactement?
how could we own or land on the moon?
Oh?
Yes.
In what sense? How do you mean? How can we pay for it?
Yes.
Or who? Ah, okay. Who? À qui ça appartient?
Yes.
Ah, good question. So, c'est quoi votre question exactement en français?
Comment est-ce qu'on peut avoir un bout de terre sur la Lune? Parce que normalement, l'espace, ça appartient à tout le monde.
Okay, that's an interesting question. Who does the moon belong to? Was it ever decided?
It was decided, actually. In 1967, something called the Outer Space Treaty was formed and signed, and it basically says that nobody owns any celestial bodies. There has been more work done on that recently, and they've decided that resources that are taken from celestial bodies can be owned by the entity that extracted them, but that's a law that's been passed on a nation-by-nation basis. The U.S. has such a law, Luxembourg has such a law, so we'll see what happens.
Autre question ici, je sais pas, quelqu'un a le microphone? Oui, allez, juste ici et puis le monsieur devant. Donc d'abord vous, madame.
Hello, congratulations on an amazing documentary. I'm just curious, is there any plan to make a similar documentary about the shuttle program?
Well, I did one on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. I would love to make more of these about just about everything that's been done. Obviously, we were doing this one because it's the 50th anniversary of the moon landing this year, but we decided to do all of the Apollo missions to give people a sense, especially people who weren't born at the time, a sense of what the whole program was like. That's a question for National Geographic, and I'll be sure to ask them that tomorrow. Thank you.
There's another question up in the back, I believe.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for making this movie. It was very, very exciting for me to watch, as I was just not born yet when it happened. Thanks for including the footage of all the people watching around and stuff. That was made it very real. Anyways, question is, what do you think is the most important or significant impact of having put a man on the moon?
I think it's probably not, you cannot measure with money, but it's probably the inspiration of teenagers to choose science massively and the motivation to push to the PhD level. When you look at the graph showing the number of PhD earned, function of time, it matches the budget of NASA at the Apollo time. And for me, this is the most important outcome, that the USA generated massively very smart people because they were motivated to work hard, and they are more or less going on retirement these days, but they made the power of the United States in aerospace.
Another question here?
Yeah. This is a question. Okay.
Thanks. It's just hard for us to see.
This is a question, I think, for Tom. The film sort of starts with Sputnik and the Russians and the moonshot, which is really, has been framed historically as a space race. For the men and women involved who were carrying it out across the decade, what do you think sort of the engine really was driving them? I mean, was it geopolitical or was it scientific? That falls away a bit, it seems. And I know in the film, the scripted film that came out, First Man, there was much talk about the American flag planting on the moon. And was it shown or not, and should it have been? And I just wondered what you thought, kind of, behind the program was really the motivation.
Well, I think the people writing the checks, Congress, the President, I think they were very into making sure that they would beat the Soviets. It was the height of the Cold War, and so there was a feeling politically that this needed to be done. However, in making this, I watched 100 hours of interviews with the astronauts over the last year and a half, and they didn't talk about the space. They would make jokes. There's a couple of jokes in there. It's like about the turtles, because they were sending turtles up into space, and so there was little moments, and but they seem to be the type of people that I have more respect for them now than I was old enough to remember. And I was a very young child. I remember Apollo 8 actually better than Apollo 11. And I have more respect for them now because they became more human to me after watching all this footage. I don't remember their interviews when I was 7 years old, but they didn't talk a lot about the Soviets. They wanted to be first, but it was more of the adventure and whether or not they could do it. And they were the type of individuals that I've seen, they were just going to do it. That was the mindset. They were going to have it happen. We did some minor things, some little things to kind of keep the space race throughout. If you hear that beep that we put in, that's actually Sputnik, and the composer put Sputnik into our score. So it's kind of like, you know, there's this subtle reminder that Sputnik is always just over their shoulder. And so there were little things like that and little asides, but I think it was more of a political call at the time about the Soviets. They just wanted to see if they could do it. That's my opinion.
Rory, do you want to weigh in?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think that for the astronauts, they wanted to go to the moon. You know? So I think that their motivation was exploration, like old-fashioned exploration and that journey. But I think the context and the finances and the people writing the checks were certainly motivated by the politics of it all. That was great.
We have another question here.
Good evening. My name is Anastasia, and I want to ask Michael and Jean-François. In the movie, we saw a lot of footage about protests against men going to the moon, and the Flat Earth Society still exists. And also, some people, they don't believe that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin actually went to the moon. So I want to ask you what we can do to inspire people, and especially kids, to learn about space, and what inspired you to become astronauts?
You'd like to start?
Well, I would honestly say that what inspired me was Apollo 11. I was 11 years old when the landing happened, and I won't go into the story now, but let's just say it made a very big impact on an 11-year-old kid. And I think the first part of your question about what we do to inspire people is this. I mean, I can think of no better way to, you know, motivate somebody to be involved. As Jean-François said, there's a direct correlation not only in the United States, but in other countries with when they have an astronaut that's on board in space, especially with today's communication abilities with Twitter and FaceTime and Instagram. People are following what's going on in orbit to a degree that's unheard of. And I think that will inspire not just people to study technical things, but also artists and musicians and others to go to space to A, experience it, and B, transmit that message.
Jean-François, do you want to add something?
Well, in my case, the same. Apollo 11, when I saw that, the teacher told us when you will be grown up, you will go to space for the weekend, and I dreamt about going to space. Not being an astronaut as a profession. I never thought about this when I was a kid, but I wanted to go to space, to see the Earth from high above, to float in weightlessness. It's only later that I realized that the only way to go to space is to make it a job, you know.
And if you notice, we started the beginning of the film, the first act, with Walt Disney. And that was done on purpose because, in a sense, at this time, and from what I remember from the later Apollo missions, it was a sense of wonder. It was very much the world stopped. Everyone stopped. And I remember Apollo 8 because where I lived, it was the Christmas Eve broadcast, and I was at the corner store. And it was snowing, and it was very, very cold. And I can still remember rushing home the few blocks from the store, looking at the moon, and then thinking I have to get to my house so I can watch the television of the guys that are up there, and just, you know, and it was like magic to me. And I think that perhaps younger generations now will get some of that magic with people wanting to extend to the moon again and beyond.
And to Mars, eventually.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this wonderful documentary. You made the choice of using a lot of American TV footage. Was that because of access, or I was actually curious to know what the Russian media were saying at the time.
That's a good question. There is some Russian footage in there, but not reporting. And that was a choice because it was made for an American audience mostly. But there's footage from all around the world that we gather. But yeah, there was reporting. From what I understand, when the moon landing happened, there wasn't a lot of reporting in the Soviet Union that had gone on.
Yeah, I remember actually looking into that myself, and there was, it was like on page 6 of the newspaper, very, Americans land on the moon. Very small.
I think we have time for just one more question. This person over here, please.
Yes, my name is Tuna Kopurlu, and excuse me. I would like to know if there could be a possibility to put a subtitle under this wonderful headline, Apollo Missions to the Moon, and say, World United for the first and only time. Because I was in Washington, and we were glued to the television. I had 2 boys, 12 and 7. Nobody slept. And we stayed all night till the morning until everything was done, and we were exhausted. But it was such a joy and such a proud, I was so proud to be in Washington, a part of this mission. And it should never be forgotten. The world was united for the first and only time, and I was a moderator at the Capitol Speakers Club of Washington, D.C. And I was asked to be the moderator for all and bring all the headlines of the world newspapers. I made a research at the Library of Congress, and I brought every headline to the audience. So we should never forget this was a united world mission. Thank you.
You can Would anyone like to react to that, this idea of the world being united?
I'd like to make a comment. I agree wholeheartedly, and it was pointed out, I think, elegantly in the film, how it was sort of for all mankind. And I would like to go back to Anastasia's question and to say that the people, about 560 in the history of humanity that have been to space, have all experienced what we call the overview effect, which is this phenomenon that was also described in the film, where you feel a connection to mankind and to your planet. So a desire to have greater tolerance, to want to work closely together to avoid strife, and also to protect the planet. When we see the atmosphere, which if the Earth were the size of an apple, the atmosphere that protects us is about the thickness of the skin of the apple. So it's not very thick, and you can perceive it quite well from orbit. And once you see that, you have a different sense. And this is another reason why I really believe in democratizing access to space, to have more people get that overview effect. I think the world will be a better place.
Gordon, you just want to wrap up in response to what Michael said?
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think there was a great line when Apollo 8 did its mission around the moon for the first time, and Bill Anders said, we went to discover the moon and we discovered Earth. And they have that beautiful image, and it was the first time that humans had seen a photograph of Earth taken by a human from space. And I think it did help send this message that you have experienced as an astronaut of this planet that we live on, and how precious it is, and how unique it is. And I think I can't have a microphone right now without saying that I'm very concerned about what we're doing to this planet, what we're doing with fossil fuels and climate change, and what NASA has helped us understand about climate change over the last 60 years, and taking all of that technology that they use to help us understand the universe and turning that back around to Earth, and they're really the source of our knowledge about climate change. And I think it's another opportunity for great moments of leadership to say, we're going to protect this planet, and we're going to bind together as humans across the globe to do what we can to protect it, because we've got 10 years.
I agree with Rory. Rory made a great film last year about Apollo called Above and Beyond, and there was a line in your film that I found very profound about the farther you go, the more you look back at Earth. To understand Earth, you know, when you're up there, you look back, something along those lines. And I think for what we did here with this film, the same is true. You can't move forward unless you understand the past. And so we tried to recreate the past as best we could so that gentlemen like our astronauts can create space programs that will take us farther and better understand our own planet at the same time.
Thank you, Tom. Jean-Francois, just a few words in conclusion.
You know the main difference between a human spaceship and an automatic spaceship? The main difference is what we call the environment control and life support system. And this is exactly the same difference between Earth and Mars. And what is the life support system of Earth? You know, in space we care about having enough water, oxygen, etc. This is the ocean. From space you realize how much the ocean is important for spaceship Earth. We are all astronauts of that spaceship Earth, and that starts from the source of the rivers. And I'm very happy that I know Monaco is very involved in ocean protection.
Jean-Francois, thank you so much.